I want to get to whether or not to ban porn. Should the federal government ban porn? Can the federal government ban porn? Doesn't the federal government already sort of ban porn and we all just kind of forgot about it and it's a little bit ambiguous? Here to help us answer all of these questions, one of the great men of Washington, D.C., one of the great men in our country who has authored a bill to outlaw online pornography. That would be Senator Mike Lee. Senator Lee, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Michael. Good to be with you.
Also, thank you for the bill. I think it's great. I've been calling for this sort of thing for a long time. And whenever I've suggested that maybe it's not the best idea to have our country, especially children, just saturated in some of the most extreme, degrading, vicious material imaginable, people tell me that there is nothing more American than hardcore, and it's protected by the First Amendment, and that if you want to do anything about it, you're an ahistorical fascist or something. You know a thing or two about the law. I think you've read the Constitution once or twice, one of the leading lawyers in the country. What say you?
Look, at the outset, we got to point out obscenity is not protected by the First Amendment. Never has been. To this day, it is not. The Supreme Court acknowledges that the First Amendment doesn't cover obscenity. The question is, what is obscenity? How is it defined? Some of those definitions have changed over time. There is, and you referred to this a moment ago, Michael, there's this sometimes unspoken but widely held false assumption that there is a universal human right or a universal, undeniable, impenetrable First Amendment right to distribute explicit material, obscene material even, and make it available to children. And there's anything the government can do about it because, well, the First Amendment. That simply isn't true. It's never been the case. It's not the case today. What my bill is about really is about trying to address the modern age. Remember, decades ago, people viewed differently than they do today. They'd either have to go to a movie theater in a shitty part of town, or maybe they'd have to buy something, a magazine or something, physically. And when they did that, typically there were laws and other restrictions that made sure that they weren't selling it to kids, made sure that if the cover was explicit, that it wasn't something that could be viewed by children. There were restrictions on it. Now in the internet age, when this stuff is widely available, children have easy, ready access to pornographic material all the time. We need to update our laws. To make sure that it's not just fair game out there so that we can protect our children. That's why I introduced the Interstate Obscenity Definition Act, along with Representative Mary Miller, to establish a comprehensive definition more appropriate for the internet age so that we can protect kids from obscene materials under federal law.
Well, this point on obscenity, I think, is so important because it's not that your bill, as some people are writing about it, would radically change the American law, impose a severe new restriction. It would just take our legal tradition and continue it and adapt it for the digital age. There have been efforts to do this before. I remember in the 1990s, or I actually don't remember it when I was a kid, but I remember reading about it. There was the Communications Decency Act, which now we focus on how that modifies social media and gives liability to social media companies. But really, it was about decency in communications. And part of that, before part of the law was struck down by radical judges, was about ensuring that kids and wouldn't have access to all this kind of crazy material. There was the Child Online Protection Act, same thing. This was passed with Republican support, Democrat support. There was a Republican Congress. There was Bill Clinton was president. I don't know. This shouldn't be so radical to me. Furthermore, we remember in 2008, the federal government prosecuted, convicted, and jailed for a particularly bad one for obscenity. So I don't know. This doesn't seem radical to me. What would your bill do? How would the law change, or how would the enforcement of the law change if your law is passed?
Yeah. First of all, it's not radically different, and it does just reflect the need to update and modernize things from where they've been since 1973. We have in place today something known as the Miller Standard. It's a reference to a 1973 Supreme Court case. The standards on it are subjective and vague, making it pretty difficult to apply to any a piece of material in particular. Although all of that said, this tries to preserve as much of the Miller test as possible, given that some of these things are now familiar. So the Miller test determines content to be obscene if it appeals to what they describe as prurient interest, as the prurient interest in sex, and describes sexual conduct or depicts it in a patently obscene, patently offensive way. And then it also has to lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. But the part that talks about depicting sexual content in a patently offensive way itself proves problematic, and it makes reference to state law. The Miller case involved state law, not federal law. There was no such thing as the internet back then. And so we need to update this so that, number one, there's a modern federal standard, a federal standard that determines what happens when you are marketing, you're distributing on a channel or through an instrumentality of interstate commerce, like the internet, across state lines. Remember, Michael, that there are all kinds of other contexts in which we have overlapping state and federal laws. And sometimes the state law will be applicable when the conduct is occurring entirely within a state. You sometimes need a federal standard if it's going to occur across state lines or through a channel of interstate commerce like the internet. And so this one simplifies it. It attempts to create a standard that is more manageable and understandable, and it supplies its own federal standard so that we don't have to make reference back to a non-existent state law because this is a federal issue. It is, moreover, worth noting that there are other circumstances in which other types of constitutionally protected activities are still subject to federal law restrictions regarding how something is distributed. Let's take the Second Amendment, for example, protects the right to bear arms. There are nonetheless restrictions, including federal laws, that make it so you're not supposed to, you can't legally sell a firearm to somebody unless certain minimum standards are met. And that would include things like the ability to restrict sales to children of firearms. We know that the obscene content, including a lot of pornography out there, does have a well-known, documentable, provable bad effect on children, on adults also, but especially children. And so that's our objective here, because applying a pre-internet standard to the internet era causes a whole lot of challenges, particularly when you're trying to protect kids.
Of course. And, you can go back even before the founding of the country in the late 18th century. You can go back to the middle of the 17th century, and you can see all sorts of statutes and legal documents pointing out that liberty cannot fall into licentiousness, or people are going to lose their true liberty. And so you have to protect against the kind of content that would appeal to the prurient interest, that would not be constitutionally protected speech, like obscenity or fraud or libel or any other manner of chatter. So to me, it seems perfectly normal. The way that you're talking about it, too, suggests that the law would really go after producers of this content. It's not that the person who's logging onto a website at night is going to have the purity police come to his door. It's just saying, look, there are bad actors who are really abusing our system, who are luring women into usually abusive situations, and who are exploiting people, and who just really have no right to do that, and have never had a right to do that in America. And the internet obviously changed a lot of people's behavior, but look, that's why we have laws in the first place, is to protect against these things. Really quickly, before I let you go, Senator, what do you think the odds are? Not nuts and bolts politics. You're talking to your colleagues. Congressman Miller is talking to her colleagues in the House. Does it get through?
Is this something that is going to pass into law tomorrow or the next day? Absolutely not. People are still grasping to understand it. Right now, there's a lot of incorrect information out there suggesting that this is criminalizing all consumption and distribution, in any circumstance. It's not true. So we're going to have to dig our way out of that. This is going to take a while. Rome wasn't built in a day, and there are a lot of reasons why we need to act on this, but it's nowhere near the point where I'm expecting passage. Again, the important thing to remember is we're updating the Communications Act of 1934, and we're talking about the distribution of content that, taken as a whole, appeals to the prurient interest in sex, depicts, describes, or represents actual or simulated sexual acts with this objectively observable intent to arouse and so forth, and taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. This would not include the other element of Miller, that the one that makes reference to the fact that it has to be patently offensive according to the community standards embodied in whatever state or local law or ordinance is at issue. It makes no sense to maintain that element of the Miller standard in this, because we're talking about a national system, a nationwide network, a channel of interstate commerce that is the internet. It is appropriate for Congress to revisit this and to come up with this new, simpler standard, particularly in the internet age.
So
that's
true.
all we're trying to do.
Well, and I love the point also. I mean, I think your point on the distinction between the federal government and matters that pertain to interstate commerce and, state standards, but also when we're living in a time that denies standards entirely, just in principle, then, the appeal to contemporary community standards is kind of a meaningless statement. Senator, no flattery at all. You're really one of the greats out there. And this issue, I think, is one of the most important issues. And it's kind of a subtle issue, so people miss it a lot, but it's one of the most important things we could do to help restore a little national health. We'll leave it there. Senator Lee, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, Michael.
That was a great clip, huh? I agree. It was. So ring the bell, subscribe, and then I'll see you on the next one.